All right, guys, so this is going to be your last and final lesson for this particular unit. So far we've covered enzymes and how they regulate chemical reactions, how they work, and factors that affect them. We just recently did cellular respiration, a major metabolic pathway, and in that pathway we were breaking down sugars to produce ATP in the presence of oxygen. And then now we're coming to another major metabolic pathway. And a lot of times students are more familiar with this one than they are the cellular respiration. But this lesson is going to be all about photosynthesis. And so just kind of a little bit of background. So going back to our cellular respiration notes, we know, or hopefully we know, that organisms have to eat, or they have to have food molecules. And we really focused on just the glucose, but that's the main molecule that's used. But organisms must take in food so that they can break those molecules down and make ATP. So ATP is essential to keep cell processes going. Now there's two main ways that organisms can get the food, or the organic compounds is another way of saying it. Number one, the organism could make it, or number two, the organism could get it from another source. And we've talked about these before back in the beginning of the class. But we have autotrophs and heterotrophs. So in an ecosystem, everything needs energy, everything has to get food. The autotrophs are the ones that can make it for themselves. So we call them self-feeders. That's what autotroph literally means. And so they're able to make their own food. Now, technically, there's two processes that autotrophs could use, okay? The main way is the one that we're talking about today, and that's photosynthesis. And if it's a photosynthetic autotroph, what they do is they take light and energy from light, and they're able to convert that into chemical energy, or those organic molecules, or food. Now there is another process called chemosynthesis, and we're not going to talk about it today. We can talk about it later. But organisms that live in areas where there is no light, like hydrothermal vents, bottom of the ocean, deep caves, there are some bacteria that are able to take inorganic compounds from the earth and turn them into food. So those are what we call chemoautotrophs, but we're focusing on the photosynthetic autotrophs in this lesson. But either way, autotrophs can make their own organic compounds. Everything else is going to be considered a heterotroph, and they're going to have to get their food from another source. So this is going to include all of your consumers. You can have consumers that eat autotrophs or eat something that ate an autotroph, or you could also have your decomposers that are absorbing those organic compounds as they break down living or once living things, okay? So what we're focusing on is the main process that autotrophs use to make these organic compounds, and that is photosynthesis. So we're only focusing on the process that involves light. And so here's the basic chemical reaction. This is something that really you should just know. We have carbon dioxide plus water plus light is going to give us glucose and oxygen. Hopefully that looks familiar because it's pretty much the opposite of cellular respiration, except for these were reactants in cellular respiration and these were products in cellular respiration. And instead of sunlight, we had ATP as a product. So we're just going to take a look at this overall reaction. And just like in cell respiration, what looks like one reaction is really a combination of many. And so what photosynthesis does is it takes the energy from light, and we use that to build these organic molecules like glucose. And this process is essential to all life. If photosynthesis were to stop, everything else is going to die, okay? 99.9% of all life is going to rely on photosynthesis. The only life that doesn't would be those chemoautotrophs that are living in those areas where you don't find light. And that is definitely the exception. Most ecosystems have plenty of sunlight. And so the autotrophs are going to make these compounds, and then they're going to pass through the food chain. So this is an absolutely life essential process. Now, some bacteria can do photosynthesis, but we're going to focus on what happens in a eukaryote. And in eukaryotes, remember, we have those organelles that can perform these processes. And so your autotrophic eukaryotes are going to contain chloroplast, and that's the organelle in which photosynthesis takes place. So just a little bit of background. We've seen this before, but we're going to go into it in a little bit more detail. It's like the mitochondria, and that it's double membrane. So we have a membrane surrounding another membrane. Now inside are going to be the two most important parts that we're going to talk about in terms of photosynthesis. We have thylakoids, and you can think of them as like individual pancakes. They're little sac-like membranes, and it's inside the thylakoids where you find the chlorophyll. This is going to be one of the main stars of photosynthesis. These are going to be the pigments that absorb that light energy. And this right here is why we can't do photosynthesis as animals, is we don't have these little molecules inside of us, okay? So your thylakoids are the individual pancakes that house the chlorophyll, and then they come in stacks. So a stack of pancakes is called a granum, or grana is plural, okay? And then surrounding that, we have the sugary syrup, okay? And so the syrup, or the fluid around the pancakes, is known as the stroma. Now, in terms of photosynthetic processes, everything's going to take place in the chloroplast, okay? In cell respiration, we started in the cytoplasm and moved into the mitochondria. Here, we're going to be in the chloroplast the whole time. So we also need to know a little bit more about pigments, and pigments are just light-absorbing molecules. It's pigments that give us the color of our skin and the color of our hair and the color of our eyes. You have paint pigments that you use to create art. Pigments are just going to be light-absorbing molecules. And so hopefully at some point in your education you've studied the electromagnetic spectrum. And these pigments are going to be absorbing this visible light, okay? And whatever colors they absorb, okay, are not the colors that we are going to see. So the colors that we see are the colors that are reflected. So if we see red, that means these other colors are absorbed by that pigment and it's reflecting red, okay? So different pigments are going to absorb different wavelengths, and different pigments are going to reflect different wavelengths, and that's what gives us the colors that we see. Now in photosynthesis, the main pigment is going to be chlorophyll, and we have two types. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. They both absorb on the red and blue ends of our spectrum. So you can see here's chlorophyll A. So it absorbs these wavelengths, kind of close to 400 there. And then it also is going to absorb down here on the red end. And then chlorophyll B, same thing, but just slightly different wavelengths. See, it's more of like a yellowy green versus the teal green. But your chlorophylls are going to be your main pigment. And then in leaves, you also find, or plants, you find other what we call accessory pigments. And many of these are called carotenoids. You can see there's some names for other ones, but your carotenoids probably makes you think of carrots, but they're going to reflect orange and yellow. And these are the colors that we start to see in fall. Typically, the chlorophyll dominates, and that's why we see leaves as green and most plant parts as green. But as we start to get less and less sunlight as we move into fall and winter, a lot of those chlorophylls are broken down, and then we are able to see those colors that were always there. They were just kind of being covered up by the green chlorophyll. So these pigments are going to be located in the thylakoid membranes, and they're kind of grouped together in these little collections called photosystems. And we could get way more technical in this lesson. I try to keep it as simple as possible. But these photosystems are where the light is going to be absorbed and the energy is going to be transferred to electrons. So there's actually two photosystems that are involved in photosynthesis. There's photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. They were named according to when they were discovered. Now in the processes of photosynthesis, we're going to start in photosystem 2 and then move to photosystem 1. But all you really need to know is that these photosystems are collections of chlorophylls and other pigments, and this is where the energy is being gathered from the light. So as an overview, and I've got lots of pictures in this PowerPoint for you, I hope you utilize and pay attention to those. But an overview of photosynthesis is, first, the light is used to make energy molecules. This is called the light-dependent reactions. And then in the second portion, those energy molecules are going to be used to make sugars like glucose. And these are called the light-independent reactions. So up here we see the combination. Okay, both of these pictures are showing the same thing. And kind of like with cell respiration, what you need to know more than anything is what's going in and what's coming out. And so these pictures do a great job of showing that. Okay, so here we have the light dependent, light and water are going in, oxygen and energy molecules are coming out. Then in the second stage, energy molecules and carbon dioxide are going in, sugar is coming out, okay? Now, I'm going to talk about this here in a second, but you might be thinking, I thought ATP was made in cellular respiration, and it is. The ATP that is made here is going to be used in photosynthesis. So when we talk about the plants making ATP during photosynthesis, this is not ATP that they can use for other things, okay? They're pretty much going to make it, and then they're going to turn right around and use it in the processes of photosynthesis. So plants are not gaining ATP here, okay? And this is why plants still have to do cellular respiration. So the ATP that is made in photosynthesis is going to be used in photosynthesis. So this is not really an overall ATP producing process, okay? In fact, photosynthesis uses energy. It doesn't really produce an overall energy form, okay? All right, so we're going to start with the first stage. And once again, I have simplified this, what I feel, as much as I can, and still do this at a college level, okay? So we're going to start with the basics. So light is absorbed, okay? And once again, the pictures are kind of helpful. I like this one. It's very basic. But the light is going to be absorbed, and you can see that it's going into those little pancakes, the thylakoids. And this is where we have our photosystems. So the light gets absorbed by chlorophyll, and it excites electrons. Now, hopefully you remember that electrons are energy, and what the light does is it actually raises them to a higher energy level. Okay, so when we say that the light excites electrons, it's raising them to a higher energy level. And when they get excited, they literally move. Okay, so they're going to pass from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. Now, in the process of passing between photosystems, this should kind of look familiar. This is an electron transport chain. So in the process of photosynthesis, when the electrons get excited and they move from one photosystem to another, they actually pass through an electron transport chain, just like we saw in cell respiration. The electrons get dropped off, they move through the proteins, hydrogen ions get pumped, and then they flow back down. So in the same basic processes, we're going to have ATP made. Okay, I don't know how much. It's not going to be a net gain. Remember that whatever is made here is going to be used in the next step. Now, ultimately, the electrons are going to end up with an electron carrier called NADP. Now, back in cell respiration, our electrons ended up with oxygen. Here, they're going to end up with an electron carrier. And so when we say that energy molecules are made, in the process of the light-dependent reactions, we're getting ATP, so that's one energy molecule, and we're also getting NADPH. That's another energy molecule. So just like before, when we're carrying electrons, we're carrying energy to be used later. So these are my two energy molecules that are made in the light-dependent reactions. Now the thing is once those electrons are gone, they're gone. And so if we did not have more electrons, this process would not last very long. The electrons would get excited, they would leave, process over. Luckily, that's not the case. Okay, so in order to keep this process going, we're going to have more electrons. And so this is where water comes in. Water is a reactant in photosynthesis. Now, at the end of cell respiration, we made water. At the beginning of photosynthesis, we're going to break water. So the water gets broken, and we get some hydrogen ions, we get some electrons that are going with it, and then what happens is oxygen's just left over. When we break down that H2O, the hydrogens and the electrons get moved, the oxygen's just there, okay? So in order to keep this process going, in order to keep electrons getting excited and moving, water is broken. All right, so when water is broken, we do that for electrons, and then oxygen is just a byproduct. Okay, so this is why plants release oxygen. It's just left over after those water molecules are broken. So here's an overall picture. This one kind of gives you a little more detail on these photosystems. Once again, I tried to simplify it. So here we have light going in. All right, when the light goes in, it excites electrons. We can see the electrons move. They pass through an electron transport chain, and when that happens, we get some ATP, okay? And then they ultimately end up with this molecule here, okay? So here's where I'm getting my NADPH. So electrons get excited, they move through an ETC, they get re-excited, and they end up with an electron carrier. So light goes in, and that helps us make these energy molecules here. Now, once those electrons are gone, they're gone. So this is where the water comes in. The water is used for more electrons, and then the oxygen is just left over, okay? So here's the main points. And for each process, we're going to do this. Once again, you need to know what's going in, what's coming out. So light-dependent reactions are taking place in the thylakoids. Light and water are going in. The light is what's exciting the electrons. The water is broken to get more electrons, okay? What's coming out? We get energy molecules. We got ATP and NADPH. They're going to be used in the next steps. And then oxygen is just going to be released by the plant, okay? All right, we haven't made any sugars yet. Photosynthesis is all about making food or sugars, and we haven't done that just yet. But we have set ourselves up to make sugar in the light-independent reactions. So this is also known as the Calvin cycle. Now, sometimes these were called the dark reactions because they don't have to have light directly. But if a plant doesn't get light, they can't make the energy molecules. And if we don't have the energy molecules, we can't make the sugar. So really the best names are either going to be the light independent or the Calvin cycle. And this is where we're actually going to make the sugar. We are in that sugary, syrupy stroma around the thylakoids. And we can break it up into three main stages. Okay, so the first stage is going to be carbon fixation. And fixation is anytime you add something to other compounds. And this is why plants need carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide is going to be taken in from the atmosphere. The plant brings it in through its little stomata. And then the CO2 gets fixed, or it gets joined up with a 5-carbon compound called RUBP. You don't have to know a whole lot about that, but just know that first the carbon dioxide is fixed to another compound. Now, this is accomplished by an enzyme called rubisco. And I think this is worth noting because rubisco, I've read before, in my other class, we talk about how it's like the most abundant enzyme on Earth, okay? This enzyme is essential for photosynthesis to happen and for us to make sugars. And so it's a pretty important little enzyme. So this rubisco, it catalyzes the fixing of carbon dioxide to this compound called RUBP, okay? Now, that's really not the most important thing. Just know that carbon dioxide gets fixed, okay? Now, this 6-carbon compound, RUBP, immediately breaks up into these 3-carbon compounds. And then that takes us to the reduction phase. Now, reduction is when you gain electrons. Remember that electrons are energy. And so this is where those energy molecules that we mentioned from the light-dependent reactions are going to be used. So these 3-carbon compounds, they're going to be energized by ATP, and they're going to be reduced by NADPH, which means they're going to gain electrons and therefore gain energy, okay? So essentially, these carbon compounds are energized. That's really what you need to know. Now, what we're going to get are these compounds called G3Ps, and we're going to make a whole bunch of them, okay? Some of them, if you look at the picture here, we had 12 G3Ps. Some of them come out to make sugars like glucose. And then the next stage, regeneration, the rest of these G3Ps are used to make that RUBP. Okay, so this is why it's a cycle. Carbon dioxide comes in, it's fixed to RUBP, it breaks up into 3-carbon compounds. The 3-carbon compounds get energized, some come out to make sugars, the rest go back to make RUBP, which binds to carbon dioxide. They break up into 3 carbons, some are energized and come out to make sugars, the rest are used to make RUBP. Okay, so that's kind of the basic process of the Calvin cycle. What do you need to know more than anything? You need to know the final outcomes, what's going in, what's coming out. Okay, now I do want you to note that it takes 6 CO2 to produce 1 6-carbon glucose. If you go back to that original reaction, 6 CO2 are needed to make 1 glucose molecule. Okay, now once the sugars are made, remember that plants have to do cell respiration. So once the sugars are made, the plants are going to use some. Okay, so some are going to be used by the plant, and then the rest are normally going to be stored by the plant. And back when we covered macromolecules, we talked about how plants store sugars in the form of starch. They also build their cell walls, which is a carbohydrate of cellulose. And so it's not like all of the sugars that are made by the plant are available to heterotrophs. The plants are going to use some, the plants are going to store some, and it's those ones that are stored that we can get whenever we eat the plants, okay, or we eat something that ate the plants. Now, in addition to that, that G3P, remember that glucose is not our only energy source. Those G3Ps could also be used to make lipids, and they could also be used to make amino acids. But kind of like with cellular respiration, the main molecule that is made is going to be glucose. So here's our main points, okay? This time, the light independent is in the stroma. We have CO2 going in and energy molecules. The CO2 is coming from the atmosphere. The energy molecules came from the previous steps, okay? And then most importantly, the whole purpose of photosynthesis is that we get sugars. So the sugars aren't made until we get to the Calvin cycle. And these are the sugars that the plant can use or the plant can store. So I included this in your notes. I thought it might be helpful because it shows kind of those overviews. So here we have our light-dependent reactions. Notice we have light going in, we have water going in, we have oxygen coming out, and we have energy molecules coming out, okay? Then over here in the Calvin cycle, I have energy molecules and CO2 coming in, and then I have sugars coming out, okay? So there's an overall review. And just a few extra things about photosynthesis. What are some things that can affect it? Well, water. This is why plants have to have water, okay? Because remember, we need water to donate electrons. The water has to be broken to get electrons, and that's where the oxygen comes from. The plants don't need oxygen for photosynthesis. The plants do need oxygen for cellular respiration, but that oxygen is actually a product of photosynthesis, and it comes from that water. So if plants don't have water, they can't make food. If they can't make food, they can't make energy, okay? So temperature, we've learned before, and this has to do with the enzymes. Typically warmer's better, but remember that extreme temps can denature. So if it gets too hot, photosynthetic enzymes are not going to work like they need to. The amount of light is going to matter. Like there's going to be more photosynthesis typically when you have more light intensity, like spring and summer, but it does vary from plant to plant. And then of course carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide was one of our reactants. So if there's not a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then there's going to be less photosynthesis that can be done. And the last little thing that I included is just kind of tying it all together. So we have two major metabolic pathways. We have cellular respiration that's taking place in the mitochondria. We have photosynthesis that's taking place in the chloroplast. Remember that their reactions are reversed, okay? So in cell respiration, glucose and oxygen went in, water and carbon dioxide came out. These are the reactants of photosynthesis. These are the products. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants of cellular respiration. And that is going to be that interdependency there, okay? The difference is energy is going to be stored in photosynthesis. Light is converted to chemical energy. And then energy is going to be released in the process of cellular respiration in the form of ATP. And so I included that little diagram for you as well. So this is going to wrap up all of our notes for this particular unit. We're going to spend a few more days practicing photosynthesis, doing some reviews, and then your test will be coming up here over the next 3 or 4 days. So just kind of be ready for that. Hopefully you've studied enzymes and you've studied cellular respiration along the way. And now we just need to add photosynthesis to our brains, okay? If you guys have any questions or need any help with anything, feel free to email me. And I hope to see you soon. Y'all have a good day.